The map beneath the red earth. No one in Europe believed the map was real. It was 1487, long before Dutch sails cut across unknown waters or British flags touched distant shores. In Lisbon, whispers moved quietly through dockside taverns about a southern land, vast, ancient, untouched by empire. Cartographers called it Terra Australis incognita, a balancing continent, a myth meant to steady the world. But in a dimly lit chamber near the Portuguese docks, a dying navigator claimed he had seen it. His name was Estevan Moura, and his final words were simple: "It is not empty." The map he left behind was incomplete, salt-stained and burned at the edges, marked with unfamiliar symbols that did not resemble any European script. Along its southern edge was a crude outline of a coastline, curved, jagged, enormous. Beneath it, drawn in red ink, were the words Terra Australis. The Portuguese crown dismissed it as fantasy. Spain ignored it. The church quietly archived it. But one man did not, a young apprentice cartographer named Tomás Valle. Tomás was not a sailor. He had never battled a storm nor stood on the deck of a carrack, but he understood lines, coastlines, currents, stars, and something about Moura's sketch unsettled him. The symbols along the southern edge were not European. They resembled patterns that told a story. Decades passed, empires rose, explorers chased gold and spices, yet Terra Australis remained unclaimed until 1509. Tomás, now older and quietly obsessed, secured passage aboard a merchant vessel sailing further south than any official record approved. Officially, it was a spice route detour. Unofficially, it was madness. Weeks into the voyage, winds shifted, currents pulled them beyond known trade maps. The sky changed. Stars unfamiliar to European navigation appeared, and among them a cross-shaped constellation burned bright in the darkness, the Southern Cross. The crew grew uneasy. Then they saw land, not an island, a continent. The coastline stretched endlessly. Red cliffs, white sands, forests beyond sight. No cities, no ports, no flags. But there was smoke rising inland. Life. They anchored cautiously. Tomás stepped onto the shore with trembling hands, Moura's map pressed against his chest. The sand was warm. The air carried scents unknown to Europe: eucalyptus, salt, sun-baked earth. And then he saw them. Figures watching from the tree line, not hostile, not welcoming, simply observing. They studied the strangers as one studies a coming storm. Tomás understood something in that silence. This was not empty land. It never had been. The first meeting came at dawn. An elder stepped forward, painted in ochre, carrying no weapon. Behind him stood hunters, calm, alert, patient. Tomás lowered his gaze in the gesture of peace. There were no shared words, only gestures. Then something extraordinary happened. The elder knelt and drew a shape in the sand, a curved coastline. Tomás froze. It matched the southern edge of Moura's map. The elder added flowing symbols across it, the same patterns that had haunted Tomás for years. This was no myth. This land had mapped itself long before Europe imagined it. Weeks turned into months. Communication grew through patience, imitation, shared silence beneath the Southern Cross. Tomás learned that the symbols were not markings of territory, but stories, songlines, each river, ridge, and desert remembered in voice rather than ink. Terra Australis was not unknown, it was deeply known. Tomás redrew his map, not to claim, but to understand. Yet history has rarely been kind to quiet discoveries. When the merchant vessel prepared to depart, Tomás faced a choice: return to Europe and reveal the continent, or remain. He looked at the Southern Cross burning above the horizon and chose silence. Years later, Dutch ships would chart western coasts. Later still, British expeditions would name it Australia and mark it on European maps as Discovery. But none would know of the first European who arrived not as conqueror, but as witness. Tomas Valle vanished from European record, yet among one coastal community a story endured, of a pale man who listened, who mapped with humility, who understood that Terra Australis was not a blank space waiting for empire, but a continent of memory. And beneath the red earth, sealed in clay, lay his final map, not marked with flags, but with stories.
Dutch sailors would later claim they were the first to chart the western coast. They would name it New Holland. They would record coordinates, measure shorelines, and sketch the red earth from a distance. But when their ships touched the Indian Ocean currents in 1616, something unexpected waited for them, a fragment of a map. Dirk Hartog was not searching for myths, he was searching for trade routes. Storm winds had pushed his vessel off course, dragging it far from intended waters. When land appeared on the horizon, it seemed harsh and unforgiving, jagged cliffs rising from endless blue. They anchored briefly, long enough to leave behind a pewter plate nailed to a post, proof of arrival, proof of claim. Then they sailed away. But weeks later, another Dutch expedition followed the coastline further. This crew did not land immediately. Instead, they observed smoke rising from inland ridges, signs of life, careful fires burning in deliberate patterns. The captain assumed it was wild flame. One young navigator did not. His name was Elias van Rijn, and he carried questions. When their ship finally anchored near a sheltered bay, Elias was among the landing party. The sand was redder than any shore he had seen. The air felt older, as though the wind carried memory. They found no villages, no stone structures, no flags, only silence, until Elias noticed something half buried in the soil near a rock formation, a clay vessel, sealed. Inside it lay a map, not drawn in European style, not marked with longitude or royal insignia, but the coastline was unmistakable, and the symbols across it were unfamiliar, flowing, intentional, story-like. Elias felt his pulse quicken. This land had already been mapped, not by empire, but by memory. That night, beneath the unfamiliar stars of the southern sky, Elias compared the map with Dutch charts. The coastline matched, imperfect yet precise in its own language, and above them the Southern Cross burned bright. He felt watched, not by men, but by time itself. The next morning they encountered them, figures appearing at the edge of the dunes, calm, still, observing. The Dutch soldiers raised muskets instinctively. Elias lowered his own. He stepped forward slowly, holding the clay map in both hands, and offering a question. An elder approached, eyes steady, expression unreadable. He looked at the map, then at Elias, then at the sky. He knelt and drew a familiar curve in the sand, the same coastline, the same shape. But he added lines that stretched inland, connecting rivers to hills, hills to stars. The land was not empty, it was interconnected, alive. Elias understood something in that moment that many of his countrymen would not. This was not territory waiting for ownership. It was country, living, remembered, sung. The Dutch captain demanded documentation, coordinates, claims. Elias hesitated. He could redraw the land as property, or he could preserve what it truly was. When the ship departed, the official Dutch records described barren coasts and limited resources, unprofitable,
unimportant. But Elias kept a private journal. In it, he wrote of the red earth, the Southern Cross, and the map beneath the soil. He wrote of a continent known long before Europe imagined it, and he made a decision that would alter history quietly. He omitted details, he softened descriptions, he buried knowledge in ambiguity. Because sometimes discovery is not about finding, it is about choosing what not to take. And as the Dutch sails disappeared beyond the horizon, the red earth remained, watching, waiting, holding its stories close beneath the Southern Cross. By the time the British turned their attention toward the vast southern continent in the late 18th century, Europe had changed. Empires had grown restless, prisons were overcrowded, wars had drained treasuries. The map of the world had become less a mystery and more an opportunity. And Terra Australis, once dismissed as speculation, now appeared practical. In 1770, when the Endeavour traced the eastern coastline under the command of Captain James Cook, the British Crown saw not myth, but solution. The reports spoke of fertile soil, expansive harbors, and strategic advantage. The land was declared terra nullius, belonging to no one. But the land was not silent. Long before the Union Jack touched the shore at Botany Bay, smoke from controlled burns traced deliberate lines across the landscape. Songlines crossed deserts and forests with invisible precision. The people who lived there did not measure ownership in fences or ink. They measured belonging in ancestry, in law, in story. When the first fleet arrived in 1788 under Captain Arthur Phillip, its ships carried more than convicts and marines. They carried assumptions that the land was empty of civilization, that progress meant replacement, that history began upon arrival. The shoreline at Port Jackson shimmered beneath a relentless sun. The British saw opportunity. The Eora people saw intrusion. At first, there was curiosity. The strangers wore heavy cloth despite the heat. Their skin burned quickly beneath the Australian sun. They chopped trees with iron tools that bit deeper than stone. They built shelters that seemed to defy wind and rain. But what unsettled the Eora most was not the construction. It was the permanence. The British did not appear to be passing through. They were anchoring themselves into soil that had never invited them. Among the Eora was a young man named Benellalong, known in colonial record as Benelong. He watched carefully. He understood that survival now required navigation not of ocean currents, but of cultural collision. Governor Phillip believed diplomacy might secure peace. Benellalong was captured, then released, then captured again. Between them formed an uneasy bridge, fragile, strategic, imperfect. Benellalong learned English. Phillip learned fragments of Eora language. They shared meals. They shared confusion. They shared misunderstandings that neither fully grasped. But beyond these attempts at diplomacy, settlement expanded. Forests were cleared for farmland. Water sources shifted. Sacred sites were disturbed unknowingly, or sometimes knowingly, by men who could not see what they did not understand. Conflict simmered. Spears met muskets. Not in grand battles recorded in European paintings, but in skirmishes, in ambushes, in quiet retaliations along riverbanks and wooded clearings. The British journals often described resistance as hostility. Yet from the perspective of those who had lived on the land for tens of thousands of years, resistance was defense. Diseases arrived silently. Smallpox tore through communities with devastating speed. Entire clans vanished within seasons. Grief settled over the harbor like fog. The British did not fully comprehend the scale of what had begun, nor did they understand the spiritual rupture unfolding. For Indigenous Australians, land was not property, it was ancestor, it was law, it was story encoded in rock, river, and sky. When land was fenced, something sacred was severed. Yet adaptation persisted. Some indigenous groups observed the newcomers closely. They studied tools, they studied habits, they studied patterns of expansion. Knowledge became survival. Meanwhile, within the colony, not all settlers were comfortable with the narrative of emptiness. Some officers noted organized land management, fields cleared through fire, yam cultivation, structured fishing traps carved into stone. Evidence contradicted the myth of wilderness. But myth was convenient, and convenience hardened into policy. As decades passed, the colony grew. Roads cut through bushland, farms stretched inland, penal settlements multiplied. Terra Australis was renamed Australia, a word that rolled more easily off British tongues. Yet beneath the expanding colony, beneath the foundations of Sydney and beyond, the older map endured, not drawn on parchment, but sung, passed from elder to child in hushed ceremonies away from settlement lights. The Southern Cross still guided navigation, not for empire now, but for memory. And somewhere in oral tradition along the coast, there remained a quiet story of earlier sails, of strangers who had come before Cook, before Philip, one who had listened rather than claimed. The British would never record that story. But history is not kept only in ink. It is kept in endurance. And as the 19th century dawned, Australia was no longer myth, nor merely colony. It had become a contested reality, forged in ambition, resistance, survival, and the unbreakable connection between people and land. The Red Earth remembered, even when the newcomers did not.
The frontier did not announce itself with ceremony. It moved quietly, like a line of ink spreading across paper. Beyond the sandstone edges of Sydney Cove, beyond the cleared farms and rough timber huts, the land stretched inward, immense, layered, unknowable to those who insisted on mapping it with straight lines. The British called it expansion. For the First Nations peoples, it was invasion without a single declaration of war. As settlers pushed westward across the Blue Mountains in 1813, guided by Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth, the colony exhaled with ambition. The inland plains promised grazing land, wealth, permanence. Governor Macquarie encouraged the push. Land grants were issued. Roads were carved, convicts became farmers. But every mile claimed by fence posts crossed country already known, named and sung for tens of thousands of years. The Wiradjuri people watched as cattle trampled yam fields carefully cultivated through seasonal burning. Rivers once shared became controlled. Waterholes, sacred, life-giving, were claimed as property. Tension hardened. Then it broke. The Bathurst War of the 1820s did not resemble European battlefields. There were no marching bands, no colorful uniforms arranged in disciplined lines. There were night raids, spears emerging from tree lines, retaliatory shootings at dawn. Settler homesteads burned, entire camps attacked in silence. Governor Brisbane declared martial law in 1824. The language of empire shifted from settlement to suppression. For the Wiradjuri leader Windradine, resistance was not rebellion, it was survival. He understood the settlers would not retreat. He also understood that surrender meant disappearance.
His warriors moved with the land, vanishing into forests, striking where least expected. The British labeled him outlaw. His people called him protector. Further north, in what would become Queensland, violence unfolded with chilling regularity. The native police were formed, Indigenous troopers under white officers used to track and disperse resistance. It was a strategy as calculated as it was devastating. Communities fractured under pressure. Massacres occurred in places that would never appear prominently in school books. Myall Creek in 1838 became rare for one reason: some perpetrators were tried and hanged. Many other killings were not recorded at all. The land absorbed blood quietly. The red earth deepened in meaning. Yet history on the frontier was not only violence. There were moments of fragile coexistence. Stockmen who relied on Aboriginal trackers for survival. Women who exchanged knowledge of plants and medicines. Children who grew up speaking fragments of two worlds. But coexistence existed within imbalance. The law favored settlement. The myth of terra nullius justified expansion. The spiritual cost, however, could not be erased by proclamation. Songlines were interrupted where fences stood. Ceremonial grounds were destroyed by plow. Burial sites disturbed by roads. Yet the stories did not die. They adapted, whispered in secrecy, hidden from patrols, carried across generations despite forced removals and mission life. By mid-century, the gold rush of the 1850s intensified everything. Victoria exploded with fortune seekers from Britain, China, Europe, and America. Towns rose almost overnight. Forests were felled. Rivers churned with sediment from mining pads. The colony was no longer fragile. It was booming. But prosperity for some meant further dispossession for others. The frontier did not disappear with wealth. It shifted further inland. Across Tasmania, then Van Diemen's Land, the Black War left scars so deep that entire Aboriginal populations were nearly extinguished. George Augustus Robinson's so-called Friendly Mission relocated survivors to Flinders Island. Isolation replaced violence, loss replaced resistance, and yet survival endured. Even when reduced in number, culture refused extinction. By the late 19th century, the colonies moved toward federation. In 1901, Australia became a nation under one flag. But that federation did not include First Nations peoples as citizens. The Constitution excluded them from census counts. The nation celebrated unity while maintaining silence about the wars fought within its own soil. The frontier had never been formally declared a war zone, yet it had functioned as one for over a century. Beneath new railways and growing cities, the older map still existed, not drawn in ink, not recognized in Parliament, but alive in language, ceremony, and quiet endurance. The Southern Cross shone above sheep stations and sacred sites alike. It witnessed the transformation of Terra Australis from myth to colony to nation, all while holding memory of those who resisted its remaking. And as the 20th century approached, Australia stood on the edge of another transformation, not of land this time, but of identity. The question would no longer be who owned the continent. It would become who belonged to it.
The frontier wars were never formally declared, yet they shaped the character of the continent more deeply than any distant battlefield ever could. By the dawn of the 20th century, the gunfire in the bush had quieted, not because justice had been reached, but because imbalance had hardened into structure. Australia federated in 1901.
its colonies binding together under one constitution, one parliament, one flag. Celebrations filled the streets of Melbourne and Sydney. Speeches spoke of destiny, progress, and a new nation rising confidently beneath the Southern Cross. But beneath the applause lingered an omission. The Constitution did not count the first peoples in the census. The oldest living cultures on Earth stood outside the new nation's legal imagination. A country had been born, but not all its children were acknowledged. As the new Commonwealth found its footing, identity became its quiet obsession. Who were Australians? Convicts turned farmers? British subjects in distant sunlight? A frontier people hardened by isolation? The answer would not come from within its borders. It would come from across the sea. In 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, Australia followed without hesitation. There was no parliamentary debate about whether to enter the conflict. Loyalty to empire was assumed. Young men volunteered in astonishing numbers. They boarded ships in Sydney Harbor beneath clear blue skies, waving to families who believed the war would be short, glorious, necessary. The Southern Cross watched as they sailed northward into history. Gallipoli was not Australian soil, but it became Australian memory. In 1915, on the cliffs of the Dardanelles, the newly formed Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, faced Ottoman defenses in a campaign marked by chaos, miscalculation, and endurance. The landing was brutal. Steep ridges, relentless gunfire, heat, flies, disease. Men who had grown up on farms and in mining towns found themselves pinned to narrow beaches under impossible command decisions. The campaign failed militarily, but in its failure, something else was forged, a myth of resilience, mateship, courage under fire, sacrifice without surrender. The Anzac legend became foundational to Australian national identity. Yet, even as the nation commemorated its sons abroad, silence persisted at home. The wars fought on Australian soil, the frontier conflicts, remained largely unspoken in official remembrance. Australia honored overseas sacrifice. It struggled to confront domestic violence embedded in its own creation. After the Great War, the country mourned nearly 60,000 dead. Towns erected stone memorials listing names that seemed endless. In small rural communities, entire generations had vanished. Returned soldiers carried invisible wounds, what would later be called shell shock. The nation hardened again, this time through grief. Then came the Great Depression. Economic collapse rippled through cities and farms alike. Unemployment soared. Shanty towns formed on the edges of growing suburbs. The promise of federation felt fragile. Australia was still searching for itself. When World War II erupted in 1939, loyalty to Britain remained strong, but 1942 changed everything. The fall of Singapore shattered confidence in imperial protection. Japanese forces advanced through Southeast Asia. Darwin was bombed. Submarines entered Sydney Harbor. For the first time since colonization, war touched Australian shores from an external enemy. Fear replaced distance. Australia turned increasingly toward the United States for alliance and security. The psychological shift was profound. The nation no longer saw itself merely as an extension of Britain. It began to imagine itself as independent. Meanwhile, Indigenous Australians served in both world wars, despite being denied full citizenship at home. They fought under the same flag that legally excluded them. Upon return, many were refused benefits granted to white veterans. Yet their service quietly undermined the logic of racial exclusion. How could a nation demand sacrifice abroad while denying equality within? The contradiction deepened. By mid-century, change stirred. Aboriginal activism gained momentum. The 1967 referendum became a turning point, with over 90% of Australians voting to amend the Constitution and include Indigenous people in the census. It was a symbolic correction, not a complete remedy, but a step. The silence that had shadowed the frontier began to crack. Historians revisited archives. Oral histories gained recognition. The narrative of peaceful settlement faced scrutiny. Australia's identity expanded, complicated, matured. The Southern Cross still hung in the night sky, unchanged, indifferent to politics, yet witness to transformation. The red earth still carried memory beneath highways and suburbs. And the question that had lingered since Federation returned with urgency. What kind of nation was Australia becoming? One built solely on inherited myth, or one courageous enough to confront the full truth of its past? The answer would shape the decades to come, because the next transformation would not be about war nor expansion. It would be about recognition. And recognition, once awakened, cannot easily be silenced again. The decades following the 1967 referendum were not marked by sudden clarity. Change was gradual, uneven, and often resisted. Aboriginal leaders, long silenced by law and policy, began to speak openly. They demanded not only recognition, but restitution, acknowledgement of stolen land, of broken treaties, of erased histories. The land itself seemed to demand attention. Rivers that had once been navigated by songlines were now dotted with dams. Forests that had been pathways for generations were cleared for grazing and timber. Roads cut across sacred grounds, severing connections older than European memory. Yet communities endured. Elders passed knowledge to younger generations. Children learned language, lore, and law in secret circles, in schools that were slowly opening to Indigenous perspectives. The 1970s brought waves of activism. The Aboriginal tent embassy in Canberra became a symbol of both defiance and hope. It was a simple structure, canvas stretched across poles, yet it carried a message louder than any government proclamation. Australia belongs to those who lived on it first. Media coverage was inconsistent. Some newspapers portrayed the embassy as disruptive, others as historic. International attention turned toward Australia, questioning the nation's treatment of its first peoples. Land rights became central to the struggle. The Mabo case, decades later, challenged the legal fiction of terra nullius. Eddie Koiki Mabo and his fellow plaintiffs argued that the land was never empty, that the law must reflect truth, not myth. In 1992, the High Court recognized native title, overturning centuries of legal denial. It was a moment of reckoning, not complete justice, not perfect balance, but a profound acknowledgement of historical truth. The Southern Cross remained above, indifferent yet constant, a witness to centuries of struggle, survival, and resilience. Simultaneously, Australia confronted its broader identity. Immigration, globalization, and urbanization transformed cities like Sydney and Melbourne. The nation no longer relied solely on colonial myths to define itself. Indigenous knowledge, history, and culture began to be included in education, storytelling, and national consciousness. But the process was uneven. The Red Earth still carried scars of frontier wars. Communities struggled with intergenerational trauma, social inequities, and continued marginalization. Cultural revival accompanied legal recognition. Art, music, and literature by Aboriginal Australians reached national prominence. The Dreamtime stories, once secreted away for survival, were celebrated publicly, integrated into exhibitions, films, and literature. Australia began to reckon with its paradoxes, a nation founded on colonization, yet increasingly striving for reconciliation, a land of vast opportunity shadowed by deep injustice. In towns across the continent, small gestures reflected slow change. Dual-language signs appeared alongside highways. Repatriation of sacred objects from museums began. Land councils worked to preserve and protect sites once taken for granted. Education shifted. Children learned not only about convicts and settlers, but about the complex societies that had existed for tens of thousands of years before European arrival. The Southern Cross still shines above it all, a celestial constant linking past to present. Beneath its glow, the land holds memory of arrival, of resistance, of survival, of adaptation. And as Australia entered the 21st century, the question remained, what does it mean to belong to this place? It is a question that cannot be answered with flags, laws, or monuments alone. Belonging requires listening, understanding, recognition, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The Iron Crown of Terra Australia, if it exists at all, is not forged from gold or empire. It is forged in memory, in the endurance of people, in the stories carried across centuries, beneath the Southern Cross, across red earth that has witnessed everything. The 21st century arrived with a digital pulse and global connectivity that reshaped Australia in ways unimaginable a century before. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne throbbed with commerce, culture, and diversity. Skyscrapers reflected sunlight on red earth that had once been traversed only by foot, by canoe, by songlines older than any map. Yet the land remembered. The bush, the deserts, the rivers carried memory through the wind. Beneath urban sprawl, beneath railways, beneath roads, the stories of the continent's first peoples persisted. They were alive in language, art, and song. Indigenous activism did not fade with time. It evolved. Leaders and elders demanded more than recognition. They demanded equity, agency, and justice. Land rights cases continued to reshape legal precedent. Agreements between governments and communities returned sacred sites to rightful custodians. Cultural revival programs brought Dreamtime stories, songs, and ceremonies back into schools, galleries, and public life. National holidays became moments of reflection. NAIDOC Week, Reconciliation Week, these were no longer ceremonial placeholders. They were reminders that belonging is not granted, it is earned, acknowledged, and shared. Young Australians grew up learning dual histories. They learned of convicts and explorers, but also of millennia-old civilizations that had mapped the land through memory, not ink. They learned that the continent they called home had not been empty when Britain arrived. Media, film, and literature began to tell fuller stories. Documentaries highlighted both European expansion and Indigenous resistance. Novels explored frontier life from both perspectives. Plays, paintings, and music incorporated ancient songlines and ancestral knowledge. The nation's imagination expanded, reframing identity not as inheritance alone, but as engagement with history, land, and culture. Yet challenges persisted. Socio-economic inequities, systemic discrimination, and historical trauma remained present realities. Rural communities often struggled with access to healthcare and education. Urban areas witnessed tension between rapid development and cultural preservation. Climate change introduced another layer of urgency, threatening sacred sites, ecosystems, and the land itself. Amid these pressures, moments of profound connection emerged. Elder councils guided young leaders. Cross-cultural partnerships protected land and knowledge. Indigenous entrepreneurs, scholars and artists gained recognition, influencing policy, education and global awareness. In every major city, in every remote community, the Southern Cross remained. It was a constant reminder of orientation, navigation and continuity. Beneath its light, Australians of all backgrounds were learning what it truly meant to belong, to recognise the past, to act in the present, to preserve the future. The iron crown of Terra Australis, once an idea whispered through maps and stories, now revealed itself not as a physical object, but as a legacy, the endurance of memory, culture and resilience. It was found in the knowledge that the continent had always belonged to those who understood it most deeply, its first peoples, and that true nationhood required acknowledgement, inclusion and respect. Australia in the 21st century is not simply a nation of settlers, soldiers or immigrants. It is a living mosaic. Its identity is woven from millennia of survival, from courage in the face of displacement, from resistance, adaptation and reconciliation. The land remains red. The winds still carry story. And beneath the Southern Cross, the echoes of Terra Australis remind all who listen that history is never truly silent, and that belonging, once denied, must now be claimed with honesty, humility, and care.